please read item 2 into the record.
Report of the Land Use Committee, Agenda Item 2, Council Bill 120534, relating to tree protection, balancing the need for housing production, and increasing tree protections, and amending Section 23.44.020, 23.47A.016, 23.48.055, 23.76.004, 23.76.006, and Chapter 25.11 of the Seattle Municipal Code. The committee recommends that City Council pass as amended the council bill.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Strauss, as chair of the committee, you are recognized in order to address this item.
Councilmember Herbold, may I make a motion to postpone?
I think procedurally we're going to hear from the sponsor first, and then when I ask for comments, then that will be the time for you to make a motion to postpone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Pro Tem. And it's good to see so many of you in this chamber today. I'm going to give some remarks right now regarding both this Council Bill 120534, the Tree Protection Bill, as well as Council Bill 120535, the next bill on today's agenda, which is the Tree Protection Budget Appropriations. First, we're going to start with a bit of history. This bill was introduced on March 21st. I invited colleagues to committee and to submit amendments to this bill ahead of the amendment deadline. We had a total of 6 meetings plus 1 public hearing for a total of 7 meetings that were almost exclusively dedicated to this bill, except for 1 legally required bill to pass within a certain time frame. Urban Forestry Commission asked for more time, and we extended the time by an additional week, and we have provided more time since the bill has passed out of committee. We passed the Tree Protections Bill out of committee on May 4th after a 6-hour-long committee meeting where we had over 50 amendments to discuss. We only take up this level of policy during budget, and we had to mirror the budget process to accomplish this. This is why amendments at full council are not welcome. We have had the opportunity to have all council members participate ahead of the deadline, and the amount of amendments that committee are just not appropriate here at council. This has been known for some time. This bill has been before the public for 2 months for a total of 63 days. The effective date for this bill is 60 days, which is double the typical timeline. We also extended the typical time for a bill moves out of committee to full council, which would have been 5 days, and we increased it to 19 days, almost 4 times the regular schedule. I've heard the calls for the delay, and I do not believe delaying the passage of this bill is prudent at this time for several reasons. The threat of increased cutting ahead of new regulations is a present threat. Delaying this bill will lead to more trees being cut down without the protections contained within this bill. With a 60-day implementation timeline, we have the time needed to make changes to any flaws should they exist. And more importantly, creating public policy is an iterative process, meaning we can draft cleanup bills in the future. I'm open to working with Urban Forestry Commission and other stakeholders to address their concerns through cleanup legislation. And these are not just words. We regularly pass cleanup bills. Last year, when we passed the arborist registration legislation, this year we followed up with the cleanup legislation based on feedback from high road arborists. And this was accomplished before the items fixed had unintentionally caused harm, because I know my colleagues do not want to sit up here and pass public policy that creates harm. And we know that sometimes best efforts present require changes. If we delay the bill's final passage, we will not enact the important tree protections I've been waiting for half of a decade, and some others have been waiting for 2 decades. Having a budget level amendment conversation at full council will not be productive, and sending this bill back to committee at this time will create more harm than benefit, because the schedule will not allow us to take up further consideration for many months beyond July. Again, we have the opportunity to pass cleanup legislation moving forward. I want to talk about this bill specifically. The current code without this bill only protects approximately 17,000 trees. This new protection ordinance expands protections to a total of 175,000 trees across our city. That's a really big difference. That is a high number of trees that are not protected today. Tier 1 trees replace heritage trees that can only be removed for hazardous conditions. If a Tier 1 tree is removed due to hazardous conditions, with this legislation, it must be replaced. That is not the conditions today. This is a new requirement. And as I said, there's no current requirement to replace a heritage tree today, should it be replaced. Tier 2 trees replace exceptional trees. And I know there's disagreement about what we call them, but the fact of the matter is we are adding protections to these trees. And we're also lowering the threshold for smaller trees get protected than are today. That's the easiest way to say it. Previously, trees had to be 30 inches at diameter standard height. And with this legislation, it is now 24 inches diameter standard height. Tree groves are now protected under tier 2 tree standards, no matter their size. And that was an amendment that I helped pass. Tier 3 trees will be trees that are 12 inches to 24 inches in diameter. These trees will need to be replaced on site if removed, or the property owner will have to pay the fee. Tier 4 trees are between 6 inches and 12 inches in diameter, and this legislation requires that these trees be delineated and shown on project proposals. I would love to see more protections, and we didn't get there in this bill. And we are now setting the framework to add protections in the future. With replacement, this legislation requires that Tier 2 and 3 trees that are removed due to development must be replaced by one or more trees, and the size and species of the replacements must be roughly proportional to what is removed. It also adds 5-year monitoring and maintenance requirements for the property owners for these newly planted replacement trees on private property. The removal of the planted replacement trees is prohibited regardless of their size or tier, unless the removal is approved by a future permit, which still takes into consideration the fact that they have to be replaced. Allowable development areas shall not include any portion of the parcel containing a biodiverse area or corridor or riparian corridor, priority habitat, priority setback, wetland buffer, or steep slope erosion area. This legislation establishes a system of payment in lieu rates if a tree is not replaced. This comes directly out of the pockets of developers, either their profits or makes housing more expensive. I'm wide-eyed about that, and I've heard a lot of negative feedback from both affordable and market rate developers because I am charging them an additional fee. These amounts are based on the cost for city departments to plant and maintain newly planted trees for 5 years. These costs include things like watering and minor pruning. It addresses the lack of trees in historically underserved communities through the establishment of this pay in lieu program, and this will help fund planting and maintenance programs around the city. Regarding tree protection areas, the tree protection area is required for all existing Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 trees that are not removed during development, as well as any tree located off-site on private property or any tree planted on-site as part of the required mitigation. A clear description for determining the tree protection area, which shall be determined based on the species tolerance and expectations of impacts of construction activities, size, age, health, soil, and soil conditions. It also indicates that the tree protection area shall be a static number determined by the trunk diameter method. For every 1 inch of the tree, the requirement is for 1 foot radius around the tree. This is an ANSI 3000 standard. This was a change that was made in committee based upon Urban Forestry Commission feedback that was made in real time through partnership with council members, with my partners here. For properties going under development, a tree protection area will also be required for trees located off the site and newly planted trees. This was another one of my amendments. If a tree is on the property line and has roots or branches that are extending into the property that is being developed, that tree has to have a tree protection area. This was something that we included during the amendment process. The section does replace current floor area ratio with building standards in low-rise and mid-rise zones that allow for hardscape allowances of 85% of the coverage of the lot. I've heard a lot of conversation about this today. I want to be very clear that this percentage is based upon what the city requires of builders to provide. We are not changing the size of the buildings allowed on these sites. We are simply taking into consideration the fact that beyond the floor area ratio and the building site coverage, which is only about 30 or 35%, the city requires amenities, common space, whether it's benches or picnic tables, requires parking, it requires walkways, it requires all sorts of things, and landscaping. Under current code, there's no flexibility to adjust these amenity requirements or other things that the city requires. Under current code, a builder could be required to take out a tree and replace it with landscaping or replace it with a picnic bench. This isn't okay. The amendments that I've provided allow greater flexibility for builders to move their buildings around the site to reduce these amenities that the city requires in order to preserve trees. I want to be clear about that again. The amendments that I've provided allow for these amenities to be reduced in order to preserve trees. Builders have another option. They could cut down the tree, and then they would have to pay for it to be replaced, or they would have to pay the fee, which again eats into their profits or increases the cost of housing. And under current code today, we as city policy are saying we should prioritize a picnic bench over a tree. This legislation before us changes that. In addition to trees on private property, this legislation requires that street trees be planted in the right-of-way for new construction of single-family homes and building additions in neighborhood residential zones. Street trees are required for development that would add one or more principal dwelling units on a lot. Existing trees shall be retained unless Director of Transportation approves their street tree removal. If it's not feasible to plant street trees in the right-of-way, parking strip, planting strip, whatever you want to call that strip, a 5-foot setback shall be planted for the street trees along the inside lot of the front yard. When an existing structure is proposed to be expanded by more than 1,000 square feet, one street tree is required for every 500 square feet over the first 1,000 of additional structure, with up to a maximum number of trees that would be required under construction. Tier 1 trees may not be removed unless in emergency situations or they are hazardous. Under current code, they are not required to be replaced. This legislation also restricts the removal of all Tier 2 trees. Removal of a Tier 2 tree for any reason other than construction or safety is now prohibited. What we have seen from the canopy report is that the majority of our canopy loss is occurring in single-family homes that are not in development. This stops that practice from occurring. This legislation adjusts the removal limits when there's no development proposed for an allowance. Under current code today, a homeowner in a neighborhood residential in a single-family neighborhood could remove 9 trees over a period of 3 years. This legislation changes that to 2 trees over 9 years. And again, with the canopy assessment that was provided to the city, neighborhood residential and single-family homes outside of development is exactly where we are experiencing the highest rate of loss. We also update the hazardous tree removal regulations so that they are more in line with current industry standards for tree risk assessment evaluation. And the other change from our current code is the additional requirement that hazardous trees that are 12 inches in diameter or more must be replaced if they are removed. Today, there is a loophole that is being used and abused. And that loophole is having people come in, determine that a tree is hazardous when it is not, and it can be cut down without any replacement, without any payment. And this bill changes that. This bill does allow for trees to be removed or pruned if there's immediate safety or public hazard. And this bill adds language so that if a tree violation is found to have occurred because people want their views for their property or increase market value or expand the potential for development, or was the result of negligence by a contractor, then the penalty amount would be tripled as punitive damages. When we talk about carrots and sticks, that's what I'm talking about here. We're providing flexibility that is needed to build the housing that we need, and
Please,
we need to
no comments.
And we must pass these protections that so many of us have been waiting for. Also, a covenant shall be required prior to the issuance of any permit or approval that includes modifications to development standards to avoid the development within a tree protection zone for tier 1, 2, and 3 trees. And a survey is required for future development. Process changes regarding tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 trees, including off-site tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 trees with canopies overhanging and or roots extending onto a lot, are required to be documented on all plan review sheets within a plan set submitted for the master use permit or building permit. Tree protection areas determined for all tier 1, 2, 3 trees that will be retained during development are required to be identified on those site plans. Site plans are required to include any existing tree in its root protection area that is documented to be retained by a previous master use permit or building permit. For the developments that restrict at least 40% of rental units to occupancies that are 60% area median income or less, are able to increase their flexibility regarding the set of the amenities that I spoke about, because what we know is that affordable housing projects are using public dollars to build the housing that we desperately need. And we are giving them even additional protections because we know that we need to have the trees at these affordable housing units. Cliff Cawthorn was here earlier. He's left now. He works for Habitat for Humanity. And they did a development along the route that I walked home from middle school. Has beautiful trees. And there was a choice made to protect the trees there. And that resulted in 1 fewer units. And while it might not seem like 1 fewer units is a big deal, that's 1 fewer family that is able to own a home at an affordable rate and create generational wealth and equity. And the importance of preserving that tree is real, because it creates a much nicer habitat for everyone living in that place. I want to see increased plantings, and this bill does that. I will tell you that there were a lot of things that I wanted this bill to do that I didn't get to achieve, and that's why I want to continue working with you to continue this process. This is not a one-time deal, and I know for many it feels that way, because for some they've been working on this bill for 20 years, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. One of the things that I wanted to work on is the expansion of SPU's Trees for Neighborhood programs that has already helped Seattleites plant over 13,000 trees in their yards. I want to see site-appropriate trees. Excuse me, I wrote my notes incorrectly here. One of the other places that we're seeing a great amount of tree loss is on our city-owned land and parks, and we need to adjust that. Using in lieu fees, we will be able to address that. And what I note is that I want to see those in lieu fees also be able to be planting trees on private property as well. Trees for Neighborhoods program does just that. I've heard comments about new housing developments not having affordable housing. I'll tell you, when I lived on 63rd Street in Ballard, I watched organically affordable single-family homes turned into multiple townhomes that were out of reach for most families that I grew up with in Ballard. What I didn't see were the dollars that were paid into MHA that went directly into funding affordable housing. And I know that there's a conversation about the units should be created in place, and that it's bad that the dollars are being used to create affordable housing in other places. But what I can tell you is that when units are created in place, it is harder to track. And I can tell you, when I've successfully brought affordable housing projects to District 6, it is with the dollars that were born on the backs of people building townhomes. And so when I lived on 63rd and I saw those townhomes go up across from me, I did not see the money that was being paid that eventually created the affordable housing in my neighborhood. I want to talk about some of the amendments that have been passed. Councilmember Peterson, you had a great amendment incorporating prior findings from the 2001 tree protection ordinance and recitals from the 2009 temporary tree protection ordinance. We also increased the potential modifications to development standards, as I talked about regarding the amenities. We've clarified that the basic tree protection cannot be modified, which means that it can't be shrunk. We use trunk diameter method, again, the ANSI 3000 standard, rather than the drip line, and this is going to help the survival of trees. We added the consideration of off-site trees, as I mentioned, that are on and owned, which unfortunately, this is a reality of our society, is that trees are private property. And when a neighboring private property owner has a tree, we need to make sure that that tree is protected during any development as well. We've required SDCI to examine their existing processes and practices and make modifications. We've set the minimum in lieu fee for tier 1 or 2 trees at over $8,000. This would also require that SDCI make the locations of relocated and replacement trees planted available via publicly accessible online mapping tool by next year. The reason that I set that date of next year when we did the cleanup to the arborist legislation, which was a number of months ago, is because I want to add more things to be required on that publicly accessible map. And rather than ask SDCI to do it multiple times, we set a timeline that was reasonable to make these other additions. We've also required registered tree service providers that are issued 2 notices of violation for illegal removal of any regulated tree within a 1-year period be removed from the registry. We've stated the council's intent that SDCI identify options to reduce the financial impact of costs associated with removal of hazard trees on households that are at or below 80% area median income. We've maintained and expanded access to SDOT's Heritage Tree Program and provided additional resources to SPU to expand their Trees for Neighborhood program. We've developed a culturally and linguistically appropriate plan to inform residents of tree service providers and tree service providers of the updated tree regulations, thanks to Councilmember Morales. We've requested that the executive identify the causes of tree loss on city-owned and city-managed property and proposed potential improvements to the city's efforts to increase tree canopy and to maintain existing trees on city-owned and city-managed property, thanks to Councilmember Nelson. We've requested the City Budget Office to submit legislation with the 2024 proposed budget that would establish a fund to receive in lieu fees and other grant donation revenues received by the city related to protecting and growing our city's canopies, thanks to Councilmember Peterson and the Urban Forestry Commission. We've created an independent urban forestry division with dedicated staff. While it's in SDCI, it assigns urban forestry oversight to the Office of Sustainability and Environment. Again, my amendment that the Urban Forestry Commission recommended. It also clarifies that the risk assessment should be determined according to standards established by International Society of Arboriculture, ANSI. Clarifies that registered tree service providers conducting tree risk assessments are required to have either an employee or person on retainer who is currently credentialed with an ISA tree risk tracker qualification. I guess the Q is redundant. It adds pathogens to the proposed exemption for trees that are infested with insects or pests. It exempts the removal of dead trees from some of the requirements for hazardous tree removals because we know that sometimes people are deciding to not take down their dead tree because of the cost at hand. We do allow tree removal to improve access for elderly people with disabilities. And we prohibit applications for new developments on site with an active tree code notice of violation. And this was something that Councilmember Peterson and I partnered on. And this came from a direct experience I had while, again, living on 63rd Street in Ballard, when I watched a neighbor cut down a beautiful tree because it was required by the person purchasing their lot to build townhomes. And it's okay in some ways if this is done legally. But what we had in the original bill was a loophole, and we worked to close that loophole. We also modified the purpose and intent section to include references to increasing Seattle's climate resilience and reducing heat islands. And Councilmember Peterson, thank you for your amendment requiring the removal of invasive species during development. Because again, where we are in history right now is a transition point from a climate that we have experienced for hundreds of years into a climate that is much hotter. Trees that typically survive may not soon. We need to take out the invasive species that have been brought to this community over the last 200 years, and we need to plant trees that are appropriate for our region and that will survive climate change. Again, I didn't get everything I wanted in this bill. I also think that there are some improvements that can be made. And I know that there are more opportunities to continue to work to protect trees. What I'll tell you is that we do need to protect trees today, not tomorrow. If we delay passage, I fear we will experience greater amounts of tree cutting before these protections, replacement requirements, and fees for cutting trees are put in place. We have the ability to continue working together to increase tree protections even after this bill is passed. Because, again, we have that ability if we pass this bill today, because we don't have the time to take this bill back to committee and take up all of these issues again. What we do have the ability to do today is pass this round of protections and take up remaining issues on the side through cleanup legislation. If we wait to pass a perfect bill, we'll never pass tree protections. This has been the history for the last 25 years. This policy issue has been constipated. Meaningful protections have not been passed in decades of work, which is why I understand people believe that this is their only opportunity to make meaningful change. I know in my time, I've worked to push this legislation for 5 years in good faith, and I remain at the table as a partner to continue this important work. This is not our only opportunity, and this is not the last time we talk about tree protections. And if we need to pass cleanup legislation, we will. This bill is not the last opportunity to create these important protections. Rather, it's the first big push for tree protections in over 20 years. We have more opportunities to work together, and the insistence of the perfect prevents good policy from being implemented. We have the opportunity to pass important protections today and continue working together to add more protections and make adjustments. Current issues that I heard through public comment about trees not surviving, trees being mangled, trees not being preserved during development because there's neither flexibility nor penalty for removal, and that the largest source of our canopy removal is in single-family neighborhoods outside of development. These issues are occurring because the protections that are in this bill are not in place. It's true. I've included Urban Forestry Commission and arborists at every single one of my committee meetings. We have 60 days before this bill is implemented, a similar amount of time that Urban Forestry Commission has requested for review. If serious errors exist, we have the time to identify and fix these issues, just as we did with the arborist registration legislation. We have taken more time with this bill than any other bill in my committee during my term, and I've taken every possible opportunity to include Urban Forestry Commission's voice in this policy development. Just as the trees my parents' generation planted created the canopy we enjoy today, because if you recall, Seattle was clear-cut. If you recall, Ballard and Fremont were treeless in the 1950s. If you look at photos, it is a vast difference from what we have today, and those are from programs like Retree Ballard and others. Colleagues, and I guess where I was going with that is that trees planted today can and will create the canopy we need for my children to enjoy, just as my parents did for me. Colleagues, I urge a yes vote on this legislation, not to delay this legislation, and to continue working with me to pass the next round of protections. This isn't our last chance. We need to protect trees today, not tomorrow, And what we have before us is a balanced bill that protects trees in our neighborhoods and during development while making the space for the housing our city, the fastest growing city in the nation, desperately needs. This tree protection bill protects the canopy we have today and grows the canopy my grandchildren will benefit from. Thank you, colleagues. That is the report.
Thank you, Councilmember Strauss. Before we move into debate and other motions, I do want to be very clear that just like if our Council President Juarez, were here with us, she would not accept any disruptions of this democratic process, and I will not either. We have council rules that define what a disruption is, and it does include outbursts from members of the public. So as we're moving into debate on this measure, I do respectfully request that you do not disrupt this meeting and allow the democratic process to continue. Thank you. Any comments? Councilmember Peterson.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Herbold. At the request of the Urban Forestry Commission, I move to postpone this item, Council Bill 120534, until our full City Council meeting on July 25, 2023, which is the last Tuesday in July, approximately 60 days from today.
Second. It has been
Thank you.
Moved
May
and
I
seconded
speak to the
to
motion?
postpone agenda item 2, Council Bill 120534, until July 25th, 2023. Councilmember Peterson, would you like to address the motion? And if you could also speak to the significance of the date that you're suggesting, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yes. Colleagues, I have faith in the city's Urban Forestry Commission with their expertise and their care. The letter from the Urban Forestry Commission dated May 17, 2023 stated, given the flawed and rushed process, the likelihood of canopy inequities persisting or worsening, and the limited reporting requirements, the UFC asks the council to defer voting on the bill until the end of July to allow council member conversations with the UFC and other stakeholders. Colleagues, providing more time is important not only to honor the request of a respected city commission, but also to honor our Seattle Municipal Code. As stated in the Urban Forestry Commission letter, May 17, the mayor's draft ordinance was transmitted to the City Council on March 7, 2023, and referred to the Land Use Committee on March 22, 2023. These actions occurred without prior review and recommendations by the UFC. This appears to be in violation of the Seattle Municipal Code 3.72.050.A.3, which states that it is the responsibility of the USC to provide recommendations on legislation concerning urban forestry management, sustainability, and protection of associated trees prior to its introduction and referral to any council committee. So that's just me quoting the UFC letter that quotes the SMC. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments on the motion to postpone agenda item 2 until July 25th? Councilmember Lewis?
Thank you so much, Councilmember Herbold. So I had very strongly considered potentially voting for this, having consulted with a number of audience members today, actually reaching out with concerns over this ordinance throughout the past week. Having discussed this with stakeholders, including the advocates in this room, I am not of the opinion that there would be significant changes to this ordinance if it were delayed. And I think that the question in front of the council, is whether this ordinance can command 5 votes or whether it can't. And if it can't, a process could start over if it can't command a majority of the dais. But I do not think waiting would materially change the bill. I think that we would be here having the exact same conversation. I think that there would be another request in July to delay again, because I think that the substantive changes that some members of the public are requesting and that the commission is requesting would not be sufficient in that interim to get the consensus from the people requesting a delay. So for that reason, I think the question should be called today, and then based on the result of that result on the ordinance, the council should consider what the next approach would be as regards these tree protections. And I'll speak more to the ordinance if that matter is in front of us, but I'm not going to be voting yes for a delay today.
Thank you. Other comments on Councilmember Strauss?
Thank you, Council President Pro Tem. I think I already mentioned the several reasons why I don't believe a delay today is prudent. I will again say that a 60-day implementation timeline is associated with this bill, and if serious flaws are identified, we're here to work with you to ensure that they are fixed. What does not occur with it, well, should a delay occur, there's no pathway for changes to be made. Just really quite clearly, we will end up right back to where we are. What is on the table for continued partnership, collaboration, and improvements is working on cleanup legislation. But those are two different pathways, and I don't see what will materially change within this bill with a delay. We again also have a 60-day, pretty similar amount of time, implementation timeline that allows us to fix errors should they exist. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. A couple points I'd like to make. I want to really thank Councilmember Strauss and his team for all of the work put in through the Land Use Committee on this ordinance. I'm really grateful that we live in a city that cares so deeply for our tree canopy, our carbon footprint, and the physical and mental health of our neighbors. Getting this bill to us today, it has been no small feat, and I offer sincere gratitude and congratulations to the Land Use Committee for doing so much work. I am going to support the motion for a hold, but not at all out of lack of respect for the process. I do not believe the process was rushed or lacking in deep engagement, as we've seen multiple departments working on this process for almost 2 years now. And we've received information to show how the departments have engaged with members of the public and stakeholders. As we've heard, the committee chair held 6 meetings, committee hearings, and an additional public hearing. And as we've been told, this is more hearings than any legislation has received in some time. Land use topics are very technical, full of language and policies that require a deeper than usual knowledge of the subject matter. So I'm very sympathetic, and I understand the calls for additional time. Myself, after the committee chair requested that there be no new amendments brought forward, I've received strong messages and information that have led me to begin work on an amendment that I believe would support stronger canopy preservation and restoration in what are referred to as the city's economic justice priority areas. Unfortunately, central staff and I weren't able to complete this amendment in a timely fashion and bring it to the council in the current timeline. And again, the goal of the amendment would have been to support the alignment of the ordinance with our values and goals in the Green New Deal Resolution 31895, Section 13J, encouraging preservation and planting of trees to increase the tree canopy cover, prioritizing historically low canopy in low-income neighborhoods while working closely with communities to protect against eco-gentrification. I understand that planting of trees is prioritized for these areas. I would like to see if we could do more to encourage preservation of trees in these areas as well. I absolutely understand that the parks, natural areas that contain 14% of the city's canopy saw a relative loss of over 5%, and the neighborhood residential areas that contribute nearly half of the tree's canopy saw only a relative loss of 1.2%. This suggests that development has a limited impact on tree canopy citywide. Nevertheless, I appreciate concerns raised by the Urban Forestry Commission in a letter that I just received this afternoon from the Duwamish River Valley Community Coalition about their concerns and their request for postponing the passage of the ordinance. The risk is especially acute in key areas of my district, like the Delridge neighborhoods and South Park, designated as environmental justice neighborhoods, which have significant canopy reduction. And for these reasons, I will be supporting a hold in the hopes that it will give me more time to work on this amendment. Councilmember Peterson, you want to close out the debate on the hold?
Yes, and I have heard the argument about, a postponement will result in a delay, and I appreciate that concern. So I would be willing to amend my motion to postpone it to Tuesday, June 27th, which is a 1 month postponement, to then we could then amend the bill to shave off the effective date by 30 days. So there'd be absolutely no delay in the current time frame, so that we can actually hear Councilmember Herbold's amendment and add that to the bill. So I amend my motion to Tuesday, June 27 postponement for Council Bill 120534 to remove that argument about the delay.
Madam Clerk, given that we already have a motion on before us that has a second, can the sponsor of the motion amend his own motion without requiring us to vote on the amendment to his motion?
Currently before us is a motion to hold to July 25th. And if the council members would like to entertain an amendment to that motion, they could. So someone could second the motion to amend it to June 27th. And if a majority passes, then they move to vote on the motion as amended.
Is that your intent? Okay, thank you. I will second that motion.
Thank you.
So the motion before us now is the postponement of Council Bill 120534 until June 25th, 2023?
27.
June 22nd, 2023. There's no further. Councilmember Strauss?
Thank you, Council President Pro Tem. Thank you, Councilmember Peterson, for this adjustment. I still do not support your proposed delay. And I again welcome you to work on a cleanup bill. Thank you.
Will the clerk please call the roll on the postponement of Council Bill 120534 until June 22nd, 2023?
This is the roll call vote for the motion to amend.
Yes.
Councilmember Mosqueda?
No.
Councilmember Nelson?
No.
Yay.
Councilmember Peterson?
Yes.
Councilmember Strauss?
No.
Councilmember Lewis?
No.
Councilmember Morales?
No.
And Council President Pro Tem Herbold?
Yes.
That's 2 in favor, 5 opposed.
So I believe the underlying motion is still before us. Would you like to withdraw?
I'm ready for a vote.
Okay. Clerk, please call the roll on the postponement of Council Bill 120534 until July 25th.
Councilmember Mosqueda?
No.
Councilmember Nelson?
No.
Councilmember Peterson?
Yes.
Councilmember Strauss?
No.
Councilmember Lewis?
No.
Councilmember Morales?
No.
And Council President Pro Tem Herbold?
Yes.
2 in favor, 5 opposed.
Thank you. The motion fails, and now we'll move back to debate on the underlying legislation. Are there additional comments on the legislation? Councilmember Lewis, is that a new hand?
Thank you. So I think that the question in front of the council, as I stated, is what we think of the tree ordinance that is in front of us now. I don't think there's a prospect of substantial or significant policy change given the dynamics of the discussion over the course of the year. And what I've asked a lot of people over the past week and a half is this tree ordinance better than no tree ordinance at all? In other words, is the status quo superior to the policy that has been crafted by the committee? I don't agree with the ordinance in every respect, and there are things that did not make it out of the land use committee and likely that do not have a 5-vote policymaking majority to be adopted into a permanent ordinance. that I would like to see incorporated into a tree ordinance. But I do think that the protections and the substance of the ordinance that has been produced by the process that is culminated in the ordinance in front of us today is better than the status quo policy that we have related to trees. And I think that it offers a potential platform to be built on and expanded on through the implementation process, as Chair Strauss alluded to in his remarks. And I'm going to go into the reasons that I think that is the case for this bill. First, you got to start with a problem statement, like everything that we focus on as a matter of public policy. And that problem statement is best epitomized by the tree canopy assessment report from 2021 that was released and has been reviewed by this council and several committees of this council. That tree canopy assessment states our citywide goal, which I support, of a 30% tree canopy coverage over the course of the next decade to be achieved. And that tree canopy assessment monitors the progress of the past decade to have been backsliding by 0.5% of tree canopy. So it behooves us to look at where we are experiencing the loss in tree canopy and what the causes of the loss of tree canopy are. This was certainly something that guided our discussions in the Metropolitan Park District, which I very much appreciate the support of my colleagues in prioritizing tree planting as part of that project, given that the majority of our tree canopy loss reflected in the assessment. And I know that this sometimes surprises a lot of people when we discuss changes in tree canopy, but our parks and open spaces have experienced by far the largest net loss of trees over the last half decade. 111 acres of tree loss in our parks and open spaces, the biggest single category of loss. The Metropolitan Park District investment that this council nearly doubled over what was initially proposed by the Parks Department is going to lead to a net increase in tree canopy coverage in our parks and open spaces over the next 6-year period. That was not the case in the initial proposal, which still had a projected net loss of tree canopy. So that investment is really critical, and I'm proud of the work of the council and Mayor Harrell working together to make sure that investment was there to address this critical area of backsliding and to expand canopy in our parks and open spaces where it is desperately needed. One of the other significant categories was loss in neighborhood residential, and that's the area where this particular package from the Land Use Committee provides some additional protections to prevent further backsliding in neighborhood residential areas of the city, whether subject to development or not. The really critical piece of information from the 2021 assessment was that while we saw a significant amount of tree loss in neighborhood residential, 70% of that tree canopy loss was not related to development. It was related to a number of different issues that someone living in a neighborhood residential lot might be presented with a tree that is on their property. And that could include the tree contracting disease or posing a hazard risk or a storm event potentially destroying a tree, or aging trees that are reaching the end of their lifespan, all reasons that are enumerated in the 2021 assessment. And it could also include removing trees to accommodate other uses on a neighborhood residential parcel. For example, gardens, views, building a deck, building an addition to a detached single-family house. Our code currently has insufficient protections for that overwhelming majority of that category of tree loss, that 70% of tree loss in neighborhood residential that is due to trees either getting destroyed or being subject to homeowners having preferred alternative uses for a site where a tree is. This ordinance in front of us creates a near absolute restriction on the removal of Tier 1 heritage trees, a category in the ordinance for the biggest, most significant trees that we want to protect and maintain as part of our canopy, and insulating them from arbitrary or superfluous removal. And it restricts the removal of all Tier 2 trees for any reason other than construction or safety, which is going to be prohibited per this ordinance. These are important changes for a significant category that the data and the assessment indicates city policy is insufficient to prevent tree canopy loss for. And for that reason, I think in that category, this ordinance is better than having no ordinance at all. The arguments that have been raised to me regarding the 85% lot coverage conversation, I think are things that are going to warrant additional discussion from the Seattle City Council. I don't think that those particular considerations loom as large relative to some of the other concerns that we're discussing for a couple reasons. The sites where those removals would be most relevant account for a relatively small amount of our tree coverage compared to some of the other sites that I've discussed in my remarks, like neighborhood residential and our parks and open spaces. And the 85% development footprint is somewhat misleading in how it has been publicly characterized, in that it is not a measure necessarily of the building's footprint, which accounts for typically about 30% of the building site, but includes things like on-site stormwater management, walkways, bike parking, on-site parking for cars and vehicles. There's significant flexibility that is allotted in this ordinance that has come through this process to maneuver and accommodate all of the things that we require builders through our building and construction code to incorporate and put onto a given site. I am all for going further and having a supplemental conversation that discusses how we triage and manage sites that we currently mandate for builders to include that could potentially continue to compete, even with this bill, with preserving an exceptional tree. And that could include things like bike parking storage. It could include things like parking mandates, on-site parking mandates that the city currently has. I think as a community and having this discussion have triaged the maintenance and expansion of tree canopy as a very, very high public policy priority. And when we look at the envelope of what we are mandating as a city for people to build on site, I think that we should continue to work to remove, triage, and get rid of competing mandates if they no longer are considered by the general public or by this council to be a higher priority than the maintenance and preservation of trees. So for these reasons, I think that this bill is better than not having a tree ordinance, and so I will vote for this ordinance today. I think that there are additional changes and incentives that I would like to work with the chair on, as he has indicated an interest in doing an additional truing up bill as we go through the implementation of this policy. And with that, I will make an end to my comments and turn it back over to Madam President Pro Tem.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. The sponsor, of course, will have the closing remarks. I do want to check if there are other remarks. Councilmember Peterson, I see your hand is up. Councilmember Peterson? Yeah. Your hand is up. Did you not want to speak?
Thank you. Thank you, President Pro Tem Herbold. I believe that it's vital that we clarify that while this bill might regulate and define and designate more trees, it does not absolutely protect them. This bill still allows many of these trees to be ripped out and destroyed. So I believe that's the opposite of protection. I've issued several statements about the many public health and environmental benefits of conserving mature, healthy trees throughout Seattle. Trees are vital environmental infrastructure in the face of the heat domes of climate change. I've made several attempts to support many substantive amendments, those supported by the Urban Forestry Commission. So rather than restating those positions here, I'll just read a key excerpt from the Seattle Times editorial board from this past weekend, which stated that the city council is on the verge of a very big mistake that would make Stumptown a more accurate moniker for Seattle than the Emerald City. On Tuesday, today, the full council is set to consider a new tree protection ordinance that recently passed the Land Use Committee. The trouble is, the process produced a pro-developer tree removal measure instead of one that actually preserves and grows trees. The council should vote it down and start over. As written, Council Bill 120534 will almost certainly result in diminished tree canopy flying in the face of the city's stated environmental goals. If this bill passes, next year there will be less shade and higher street level temperatures. And that's from the Seattle Times editorial board. I concur with many of those comments, so I'll be voting no today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Peterson. Councilmember Nelson.
I've been in all those meetings, so I'll make this quick. With all due respect to the Seattle Times editorial board, we have to also think this about where the trees are that need to be protected. And so I have a little graph here. This is from that tree canopy report that was mentioned by Councilmember Lewis. So basically this line right here is neighborhood residential, and that is where the greatest number of trees are to protect or to cut down. And that is what I'm concerned about. And this status quo right now, apparently our current regulations protect about 17,000 trees. With the proposed regulations in the proposed tree ordinance, that number would go up to 70,000 with a net gain of 52,000. We've also heard another number earlier today, but the point is that's a lot of trees to protect. The next two categories of a lot of large pieces of land here, this is the parks and natural areas and right-of-way equals 19,313 acres compared to 20,841 acres of neighborhood residential. Basically, this is our property. This is our canopy. And that's where we're losing the most amount of trees right now. In neighborhood residential, we've lost a net loss. We've had a net loss of 87 acres since 2016. And if you compare all of that to where the 85% hardscape that has a lot of debates around it, we're talking about the low and mid-rise zones. And so that is, to me, I want to save the trees where they are right now and where they stand to be cut down. So that is all my point. And so that is why I'll be voting yes for this. But I do recognize that this has been a difficult process. And I thank everybody for hanging in there. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Nelson. Councilmember Morales.
Did I unmute? I did. Thank you very much. I do want to start by thanking all the staff who have done a tremendous amount of work on this legislation and put in hours and hours away from their families to do this work. Particularly want to thank Yolanda for leading the effort on central staff, as well as Lish and Keedle and STCI, and all of the community members who have been participating throughout this process. Including folks from Beacon Hill and from other parts of District 2. I particularly want to thank Maria Batzayola and others for contacting our office, as well as the Urban Forestry Commission, who met with my staff for several hours over the last couple of weeks in service to this process and to our community. And finally, I want to thank Marco Lowe and the mayor's office for the work that they're doing to try to create a way forward here. And And I want to thank colleagues, especially Toby Thaler from Councilmember Peterson's office, who is sort of an encyclopedia on trees on council. All that being said, I want to be really clear that this is a very hard vote for me. I've heard from my community members, from hundreds of constituents who do feel like they didn't get a fair chance to weigh in on the process. You know, people who I put my faith and trust in and who look to me to represent them. I am going to be voting yes today because this bill is a culmination of many years of work between the chair, SDCI, the executive branch. And I also agree that this bill is not perfect, which is why I will also commit to working with my constituents and my colleagues over the next year to make sure that this bill addresses some of the concerns, and there are many, particularly around the tree canopy in the south end. As Councilmember Lewis alluded to earlier, you know, if it were possible for us to delay this vote and allow the Urban Forestry Commission to do the analysis, I think I could have supported that, but I don't think that we really had a path forward there. Even before the vote that we took today, I think that was true. So what I'd like to do instead is to continue working with the mayor's office, with SDCI and Parks and SDOT and all the others, and with our budget chair to see how we can grow the tree canopy in the south end. I particularly want to see how we can build our tree canopy by investing heavily in canopy on public land, as Councilmember Nelson was alluding to, including the many thousands of miles of public right-of-way in our city and in areas that are lacking investment in infrastructure to provide a broad public benefit, like we are needing in the South End and in District 5. So again, with that, I will be voting yes, and I want to thank everybody for their very hard work on this bill.
Thank you, Councilmember Morales. Councilmember Mosqueda.
Thank you, Council President Pro Tem. I want to thank the folks who commented today and throughout the last few months, the calls that we've had, the meetings that we've had with people who are in the room and online. And as many people noted, really there's a lack of a comprehensive protection strategy right now that's leading to so much of our shared concern around many trees being taken down, often trees being taken down for McMansions. And I think that the goal here is well stated, the goal to ensure that we promote protection for Seattle's trees, and that we do that in a way that couples with our goal for greater housing density to achieve alleviating our housing needs, our homelessness crisis, but that we increase and encourage development within the city of Seattle. When we allow for that density coupled with trees, it also helps protect encroachment into forests, forest lands, farmlands, and protects our critical ecosystem across the region. But as everyone has said today, this is a really difficult balance to strike. I think it's clear that very reasonable, educated, and informed folks are looking at this policy from different perspectives, and either it's glass half full or glass half empty, but they are well-informed and educated analyses of what continues to be an issue that will need to be evolving. As we put this into place, we will need to come back and make enhancements. This policy did not get all the way there for many, and in many ways, this is just part of the continuum of the components that we need to ensure that we are coupling tree requirements with additional building requirements, setbacks, coupling this with our Seattle Green Factor requirements that bake into code requirements for people to take actions to increase green development. This in combination with the urban forestry restoration efforts and the Seattle Green Partnership efforts to expand our forest restoration within the city, not only in neighborhood residential zones, but in our public lands, as our colleagues have spoken to as well. I appreciate that there is a call here for greater predictability so that we can build that denser housing. My hope is that we can continue to alleviate the housing and homelessness crisis by growing our housing stock and investing in tree canopy. And I am interested in what, as well as continuing to measure this. One of the things that we have heard from our colleagues is always an interest in going back and making sure that we're doing this right. And in additional conversations that I've had with the Audubon Society and others in looking at what was underlying Amendment B4, I'm going to be very interested in working with the chair and other council colleagues in the budget process to do the type of reporting that was underlying Amendment B4. I appreciate that the additional language has been sent to us and that there was clarification that this was not interested in being tied to the Green New Deal position that we had included in last year's budget, and that if we can separate the Green New Deal arborist position and the position that we included in last year's budget from the need for additional reporting, that is something I'd be very excited in working on with folks in the community to ensure that we're supporting the necessary analysis and feedback to see what is happening out there if we are in need of additional follow-up legislation. What's clear as well is that the budget will need to include additional support for that reporting. A department probably wouldn't be able to move forward on the reporting even if that amendment were seen as friendly and adopted today. So we can include that in the budget, and I'd also like to include additional support for education, outreach, and enforcement. That is something that is needed in this effort to ensure that some of the protections that are being included here and the changed requirements are really understood and adhered to in the community. So I commit to following up with you, working with our chair, our council colleagues, and our community at large on those reporting requirements and education and outreach in our upcoming budget deliberations. I agree that there's more work to be done and look forward to continuing to work with you on this iterative process. And I'm hopeful that the processes that we have begun to put into statute here today in combination with some of those other protection strategies allow for us to actually build our canopy. I'm really pleased that some of the things that are included help us increase the code requirements around mitigation, making sure that trees that are substantial remain in place. And we're doing this by changing the process. The current code only requires mitigation for trees that are 24 inches in diameter. And now with this legislation, the code will require replacement for trees that are 12 inches or greater in diameter, and to ensure that there must be the same canopy coverage as before. I think that's a positive thing. I also think that some of the requirements around the right-of-way replacement that require the public lands to have a 3-to-1 replacement in addition to this legislation is a really good thing for increasing access to additional tree canopy. And we'll continue to work with folks to make sure that we grow the approach that is being put into place today. I appreciate that there's much more work to be done. I do appreciate that the Seattle Times coverage today noted that the number of protected trees will grow from 22,400 trees under the current regulations to approximately 70,400 trees under the proposed legislation. Again, not enough, and more will come, but a great first step. And this is not being done in isolation, right? Our tree canopy assessment, Seattle's report and presentation showed by far that the biggest loss of trees has been caused due to climate change. So yes, protecting trees is part of the strategy. Ensuring that our tree canopy and additional shade is offered across our city is a critical component to that, but it's one component as part of a broader spectrum that I continue to want to work with all of you on to make sure that we're investing in our efforts to grow trees around our city and combat climate change, increase the resilience of our residents as well as our canopy, and to do this through an equity lens to make sure that we're investing in our communities hardest hit by climate change. I agree with my colleague, Councilmember Morales, that this is a tough conversation, and I'm pleased that we'll be able to continue to have conversations with all of you about how to continue this conversation on the tree protection ordinance that the good chair has committed to, and that we can continue to build off budget investments. The funding that we put in for Green New Deal investments for the urban forester position to oversee implementation of the Tree Equity Resilience Plan, the $250,000 that we invested for Green New Deal dollars to plant new trees in the right-of-way with a focus on underserved communities. The funding that we included and the report that we requested from the Office of Sustainability and Environment for more funding to plant trees, to steward those trees, and to grow the urban forestry related activities. And that in addition to the near $1 billion for trees and tree maintenance in developing in parks throughout the Metropolitan Park District renewal efforts. Again, that was $960,000 that Councilmember Lewis noted as the chair of that process. So as part of the overall efforts, a multifaceted approach here today, I will be voting yes on this legislation, but commit to continuing to work with you on the reporting requirements and also the education and outreach and any future legislation that the council and the community are able to do. Appreciate everybody's great comments and the well-intentioned comments from everybody who provided this council with their feedback.
Thank you, Councilmember Mosqueda. I have a few words I'd like to give, well, before turning it back over to the sponsor. First, want to just address the statement that the new ordinance will protect 88,000 trees, more than the 17.7 thousand protected under the current code. I understand people sort of react to that statement in a very visceral way. The reality is that the new ordinance will regulate 88,000 trees, far more than the 17,700 protected under the current code. It won't necessarily protect all of them. It will regulate them. Some will be removed, but it does increase very broadly the number of trees for which there will be a replacement requirement. So I think that is still very, very important, but I do, language matters. And I understand that, again, the folks who have continuing concerns about this particular version of the tree ordinance feel very strongly about the language, and that we're using correct language and making the distinction between whether or not we're actually protecting trees or regulating them. And regulating means that some of them may be protected, others will result in requiring that they be replaced. As many of us have done, I'm going to quote from the tree canopy study, and I quote, "Neighborhoods impacted by racial and economic injustice not only started with less canopy, but also lost more than the citywide average. While there were some canopy gains in environmental justice priority areas attributed to forest restoration programs, the losses outpaced the gains. Tree canopy cover is critical for lowering temperatures and reducing heat island effects in our warming climate, and trees are a key component of our climate preparedness and resilience strategies as they protect us from extreme heat and improve air quality. The report finds that at the neighborhood scale, a 13% increase in tree canopy is associated with a 0.5 degree reduction in temperature. As we've heard in the public hearings and in the 6 committee meetings around this bill, urban trees are not just decorative, they are important for clean air quality, mental health benefits, and wildlife in our city. Balancing our city's needs for density and conservation through a lens of environmental justice and equity is not easy. As I said before, I definitely would have appreciated a little bit more time for potential amendments and continued community engagement in partnership with the Urban Forestry Commission, as one of the roles they were formed to serve is, quote, to provide recommendations on legislation concerning urban forestry management, sustainability, and protection of associated trees and understory vegetation and related habitat on public or private property. Appreciate that many of the amendments that were heard in committee were amendments that were proposed by the Urban Forestry Commission. But as appointed leaders in the urban forestry, I really appreciate the stated commitment to continuing to turn to them for guidance and recommendations on policy, this policy as well as policy that will come later. Constituent feedback from environmental justice stakeholders show that while there are strong regulations in this bill, that many believe that it is still not quite in a place that best protects the trees in our most disenfranchised communities. As I stated earlier, my constituents in South Park and Delridge want us to not sacrifice environmental protections for density. And I think we agree that they do not have to be at odds. In closing, many of the emails that we received in the last 2 days specifically state in the subject line, fix the tree ordinance, don't vote it down. And so I'm literally deciding, as I'm listening to the debate from my colleagues, listening to public comment, and with Councilmember Strauss's pledge today to continue to listen to community stakeholders and treat this policy as iterative and fix it if necessary, as well as Budget Chair Mosqueda's commitment to propose new reporting requirements and resources for education and enforcement. I am stating that I do intend to vote in favor of this legislation. Really appreciate both the committee for the work, the engagement of members of the public and stakeholder groups. And I know that my constituents will look forward to opportunities to engage with the Urban Forestry Commission, SDCI, the Office of Sustainability and Environment, and the Department of Neighborhoods to figure out how the legislation can actually include requirements to monitor and work within the implementation to meet the needs that we've heard so many community members identify. Thank you. And with that, sponsor.
Thank you.
Closing remarks.
Closing remarks here. I want to talk about the words preserve, protect, and regulate. Protections do occur even if preservation is not attained. This bill absolutely preserves, protects, and grows our tree canopy. Councilmember Peterson, I appreciate your partnership in this work, and while I appreciate you quoting the editorial board, their writing was contained within the opinion section of the newspaper. If the news article in today's Seattle Times provides detailed reporting of what this bill will and will not do. That news story was contained within the newspaper section of the news. I want to take a step back and thank everyone who's worked on this bill, especially thanks to Naomi Lewis, my land use clerk, Yolanda, Keetle, Allie, Councilmember Peterson, Toby, and so many others. I urge colleagues to see the forest through the trees and that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. Just as the trees my parents' generation planted created the canopy we enjoy today, trees planted today can and will create the canopy we need for my children. We need to protect trees today, not tomorrow, not in June, not in July. We need to protect them today. And what we have before us is a balanced bill that protects trees in our neighborhoods and during development, while making space for the housing our city, the fastest growing city in the nation, desperately needs. This tree protection bill protects the canopy we have today and grows the canopy for my grandchildren so that they can benefit from it as well. Thank you, Council President Pro Tem.
Absolutely, thank you. With that, will the clerk please call the roll on the passage of the bill?
Councilmember Mosqueda.
Aye.
Councilmember Nelson.
Aye.
Councilmember Peterson.
No.
Councilmember Strauss.
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis.
Yes.
Councilmember Morales.
Yes.
And Council President Pro Tem Herbold.
Yes.
6 in favor, 1 opposed.
Thank you. The bill passes and the chair will sign it. Will the clerk please affix my signature to the legislation on my behalf? Thank you. Moving on to item 3, will the clerk please read in item 3 into the record?
Agenda item 3, Council Bill 120535, amending Ordinance 126725, which adopted the 2023 budget, changing appropriations for various departments and budget control levels, and for various funds and creating positions, all by a 3/4 vote of the City Council. The committee recommends that City Council pass the amended Council Bill.
Thank you. Councilmember Strauss, as chair of the committee, you are recognized in order to address this item.
Thank you. These are the budget appropriations that work to implement the bill we just voted on.
Thank you. Are there any comments on the bill? Seeing no comments. Sponsor, any closing remarks?
These are the budget appropriations for the bill we just voted on.
Will the clerk please call the roll on the passage of the bill?
Councilmember Mosqueda.
Aye.
Councilmember Nelson.
Aye.
Councilmember Peterson.
Yes.
Councilmember Strauss.
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis.
Yes.
Councilmember Morales.
Yes.
And Council President Herbold.
Yes.
7 in favor, none opposed.
Thank you. The bill passes and the chair will sign it. Will the clerk please affix my signature to the legislation on my behalf? Moving ahead to the report from the Finance and Housing Committee, item number 4 on the agenda. Will the clerk please read the short title for item 4 into the record?
Report of the Finance and Housing Committee, Agenda Item 4, Council Bill 120-572, amending Ordinance 126490, which adopted the 2022 budget, including the 2022 through 2027 capital improvement program, changing appropriations to various departments and budget control levels. The committee recommends that City Council pass the council bill.
Thank you. Councilmember Mosqueda, as chair of the committee, you are recognized in order to address this item.
Thank you so much. This bill was passed out unanimously from the Finance and Housing Committee, Council Bill 12057.